My job isn't just about servers and cables. It's about navigating a labyrinth of incredibly strange rules. Imagine needing a retina scan just to use the restroom, or having every conversation monitored for security breaches. Welcome to my life at a high-security data center, where normal doesn't exist, and every day brings a new bizarre protocol. When I first walked through the reinforced steel doors of Nexus Data Solutions 3 months ago, I thought I'd landed the perfect job. Night shift security technician at a high-security data center in the heart of Texas. Decent pay, minimal human interaction, and all the energy drinks I could consume while babysitting rows of humming servers. What could go wrong? The building itself should have been my first warning. Rising from the desert like a concrete monolith, it had no windows, no signage, and was surrounded by 3 separate perimeter fences topped with razor wire. The parking lot was always empty except for a handful of unmarked black vehicles that seemed to change positions every few days. But I needed the job, and the hiring manager, Ms. Chun, had been surprisingly eager to bring me on board after just one interview. "The work is simple," she had said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that I attributed to caffeine jitters. "Monitor the systems, follow the protocols, and above all, follow the rules. There are 6 primary rules that govern night shift operations. Break them, and..." She paused, her pale fingers drumming against the metal desk. "Well, let's just say our insurance doesn't cover rule violations." I laughed then, thinking it was corporate humor. I'm not laughing anymore. The first night, I met my partner, Rodriguez. He'd been working night shift for 2 years, and the job had changed him in ways that weren't immediately obvious. His left eye twitched constantly, and he had a habit of checking over his shoulder every few minutes, even when we were alone in the sealed control room. His hands shook slightly when he handed me my security badge, a thick black card embedded with more chips than a casino poker table. "Listen carefully," he whispered as we walked through the entry corridor, our footsteps echoing off the metal walls. "The rules aren't suggestions. They're not guidelines. They're not even really rules in the way you understand rules. They're survival instructions disguised as corporate policy." The corridor stretched ahead of us, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in a sickly green tint. Security cameras followed our movement with mechanical precision, their red recording lights blinking like digital eyes. I counted 17 cameras in the first 100 feet alone. "Rule number 1, Rodriguez continued, his voice barely audible above the hum of ventilation systems. "Never go anywhere alone. Not to the bathroom, not to the break room, not even to check a server rack that's 20 feet away. The buddy system isn't about preventing theft or sabotage. It's about making sure someone witnesses what happens to you." I wanted to ask what he meant by that, but something in his expression stopped me. His face had gone pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the constant 68-degree temperature maintained throughout the facility. We passed through 3 more security checkpoints, each requiring increasingly invasive biometric scans. First, fingerprints and palm prints, then retinal scans that held my eyes open for uncomfortably long periods, while red lasers mapped every vessel and nerve. Finally, something Rodriguez called the deep scan, a booth that required me to stand perfectly still while invisible sensors measured everything from my heart rate to the composition of my breath. "It's learning you," Rodriguez explained as we waited for the final door to unlock. "Every night, it learns you a little better. Pretty soon, it'll know you better than you know yourself." The main floor of the data center was a cathedral of technology. Rows upon rows of server racks stretched into the darkness, their indicator lights blinking like a digital constellation. The air hummed with electricity and the constant whisper of cooling systems. The temperature was perfectly controlled, the humidity measured to the decimal point, and the air itself was filtered and refiltered until it was purer than what most people breathe on mountaintops. But underneath the technological symphony, I heard something else. a sound that didn't belong. It was barely perceptible, almost lost in the white noise of spinning hard drives and whirring fans. A rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on metal, coming from somewhere deep in the server farm. "What's that sound?" I asked Rodriguez as we settled into the control room. His eye twitched more violently. "What sound?" "That tapping, like someone's trapped in the servers." Rodriguez grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Rule number 2, he hissed. Never acknowledge sounds that don't belong. Never investigate noises. Never try to find sources of unexplained phenomena. Some things in this facility are better left unexamined." The control room was a bubble of relative normalcy. Ergonomic chairs, multiple monitors displaying system status, and even a small coffee station. But the walls were lined with additional cameras, and I noticed that every conversation was being recorded and transcribed in real time on one of the monitors. Even our whispers were being analyzed by automated systems that flag keywords and emotional indicators. "Who's watching the watchers?" I muttered, nodding toward the transcription screen. "Everyone and no one," Rodriguez replied. "The night shift exists in a gray area. During the day, this place crawls with technicians, executives, and government contractors. But at night, we're the only human presence for miles. The systems monitor us, the AI analyzes us, and somewhere in the digital depths of this place, algorithms make decisions about our continued employment based on data we'll never see." As if summoned by his words, the main monitor flickered and displayed a message. "Night shift personnel. Mandatory rule review in progress. Compliance metrics being calculated." My badge suddenly felt heavier around my neck, and I realized it wasn't just an ID card. It was tracking my location, my movement patterns, probably even my vital signs. The weight of constant observation settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. "The third rule," Rodriguez continued, his voice now barely a whisper, "is that all digital devices must be surrendered before entering the server floor. Not just turned off. Not just placed in airplane mode. Completely surrendered. They're kept in Faraday cages during our shift to prevent any possibility of data transmission." He gestured to a wall of metal lockers, each equipped with electronic locks and additional sensors. Even our smartwatches, fitness trackers, anything with a circuit board. The official explanation is preventing electromagnetic interference with sensitive equipment. The real reason is that they don't want any record of what happens here leaving the building through unauthorized channels. I thought about my phone, locked away in one of those metal boxes, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. For the first time in years, I was completely disconnected from the outside world. No emergency contacts, no ability to call for help, no way to document anything unusual that might occur. "Rule number 4 is the strangest," Rodriguez said, checking his watch, an old mechanical Timex that barely qualified as technology. "Complete sanitization protocols must be followed at all times. Not just hand washing. Complete decontamination procedures between every task, every room change, every interaction with equipment." He led me to what looked like a medical airlock between the control room and the server floor. Inside were dispensers for antibacterial gel, antiviral spray, and something labeled simply as "Neural Cleanse" that smelled like ozone and made my sinuses burn. "Neural Cleanse," I asked, reading the label more carefully. "Don't ask questions about things you're not ready to understand," Rodriguez warned. "Some protocols exist for reasons that won't make sense until it's too late for the knowledge to help you." The sanitization process took nearly 10 minutes and left my skin raw and my throat burning. But as we emerged onto the server floor, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Despite the sterile environment and constant air filtration, there were stains on the floor between some of the server racks. Dark stains that had been scrubbed, but not completely removed. Stains that looked suspiciously organic. "Rodriguez," I whispered, pointing to the marks. He followed my gaze, and his face went white. "Rule number 5, he said quickly, grabbing my arm and steering me away from the stained area. "Never document anomalies. Never photograph unusual incidents. Never create any record of deviations from normal operations. The facility has its own way of handling irregularities." As we walked deeper into the server farm, I began to notice more details that didn't belong in a normal data center. Some of the server racks were labeled with designations I'd never seen before, cryptic combinations of letters and numbers that seemed to follow no standard naming convention. Others had additional cooling systems that were far more sophisticated than necessary for computer equipment. And in the far corner of the facility, barely visible in the darkness, stood a section that was cordoned off with yellow caution tape and additional biometric locks. "What's in the restricted section?" I asked. Rodriguez stopped walking. For a long moment, he didn't respond, just stared at the cordoned area with an expression of pure terror. "That's where rule number 6 applies," he finally whispered. "And rule number 6 is simple. Never, under any circumstances, enter the restricted section without direct authorization from Level 7 management. Most employees don't even know Level 7 exists. And those who do, well, they don't stay employees for very long." The tapping sound was getting louder, and now I could tell it was definitely coming from the restricted section. A rhythmic, almost frantic percussion that seemed to be responding to our presence. As we stood there, the sound changed, becoming more complex, more urgent, almost like a code. Rodriguez grabbed my shoulder with trembling fingers. "We need to get back to the control room," he said. Now, as we hurried back through the maze of servers, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by more than just cameras. The shadows between the racks seemed to move independently of our passage, and several times I thought I saw figures standing motionless in the darkness, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. But every time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there but humming metal and blinking lights. The control room felt like a sanctuary after the oppressive atmosphere of the server floor. But even there, I couldn't escape the sensation of being observed and analyzed. The transcription monitor had filled with our conversation, and I noticed that certain phrases had been highlighted in red and flagged for additional review. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked Rodriguez as we settled in for what would be 8 more hours of monitoring systems that seemed to monitor us right back. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days, he replied without hesitation. "I know exactly because I count every shift. Every night I survive here is another night closer to having enough experience to transfer to day's shift, or enough saved up to quit entirely. Why don't you just quit now?" Rodriguez laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You can't just quit Nexus Data Solutions. There are non-disclosure agreements, non-compete clauses, and psychological evaluations. They need to make sure you're stable enough to reintegrate into normal society. The screening process for leaving is almost as invasive as the screening process for getting hired." The rest of that first night passed in a blur of system monitoring, rule explanations, and growing unease. Every shadow seemed to hide something dangerous. Every sound carried implications I couldn't understand, and every protocol felt designed to keep us isolated and compliant rather than ensuring actual security. As dawn approached and the day shift prepared to take over, I realized that I hadn't just taken a job at a high-security data center. I had voluntarily entered a carefully constructed maze of psychological control and technological surveillance, where the rules weren't meant to protect the data. They were meant to protect something else entirely, something that lived in the darkness between the servers, something that tapped against metal in the restricted section, something that required human witnesses to monitor its containment. And I was now part of that containment protocol, whether I understood it or not. 3 weeks into my employment at Nexus Data Solutions, I began to understand that the rules weren't just guidelines. They were a carefully constructed barrier between sanity and something far more sinister. The no digital footprint rule that had seemed merely paranoid during my first night had revealed itself to be a form of digital quarantine, designed to prevent contamination from spreading beyond the facility's walls. Rodriguez had been replaced 2 days earlier. No explanation, no goodbye, just a brief announcement that he had been reassigned to a different project. His replacement was a woman named Sarah Chun, no relation to the hiring manager, who had worked at the facility for 4 years and spoke about the rules with the resigned acceptance of someone who had stopped questioning the logic behind them. The digital footprint rule exists because everything in this facility is monitored, recorded, and analyzed, Sarah explained as we completed our pre-shift sanitization. But it's not just about keeping data secure. It's about keeping certain types of data from escaping into the wider digital ecosystem. She handed me a modified smartphone, a device so heavily modified that it barely resembled its original form. The screen was smaller, the processing power deliberately limited, and it could only connect to the facility's internal network. Even then, it required constant biometric verification to function. "This is your work device," she said. "It's the only digital tool you're allowed to use during your shift. It's hardwired to prevent any data transmission beyond the facility's firewall, and every keystroke, every screen interaction, every breath you take while holding it is recorded and analyzed." The device felt wrong in my hands. The metal was too warm. I could feel a subtle vibration that suggested it contained far more technology than was visible on the surface. When I turned it on, the startup screen displayed a logo I didn't recognize, a stylized eye surrounded by concentric circles that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "What kind of data are we protecting?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. Sarah's expression darkened. "The kind that changes people. The kind that spreads like a virus through digital networks. The kind that our employers have learned to contain, but haven't yet learned to destroy." That night, I discovered what she meant. We were conducting routine maintenance on server bank C when my work device began displaying error messages I had never seen before. Instead of standard system alerts, the screen filled with text that seemed to writhe and shift as I read it. The words were in English, but they formed sentences that hurt to comprehend, combinations of concepts that my brain refused to process normally. "Don't read it," Sarah warned, grabbing the device from my hands. "That's why we have the digital footprint restrictions. Some information is infectious. It can spread through electronic networks, corrupt other systems, and eventually reach human minds that aren't properly prepared for it." She performed a series of rapid gestures on the device's screen, executing what appeared to be a complex digital exorcism. The strange text disappeared, replaced by standard diagnostic information, but the damage was already done. I could feel something different in my head, a subtle wrongness that hadn't been there moments before. The clean desk, clean mind, clean everything policy isn't about preventing data theft, Sarah continued as she guided me through another sanitization cycle. It's about preventing mental contamination. Some of the information stored in this facility has properties that we don't fully understand. It can leave residual traces on surfaces, in air molecules, even in the quantum fluctuations of electronic equipment. The sanitization booths suddenly made more sense. The NeuroClean solution wasn't just an aggressive disinfectant. It was designed to remove microscopic traces of something that could affect human consciousness. The fact that it burned my sinuses and left my thoughts feeling slightly fuzzy wasn't a side effect. It was the intended result. "How is that possible?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that normal physics might not apply to everything stored in this facility. "We don't ask how," Sarah replied. "We just follow the protocols that keep us functional. The scientists and researchers who design these procedures learn from experience what happens when the contamination spreads. Most of them aren't working here anymore." She gestured toward a memorial plaque mounted on a wall of the control room that I had somehow never noticed before. It listed 17 names under the heading in memory of our colleagues who made the ultimate sacrifice for scientific progress. The dates range from 2 years ago to just 6 months past. What happened to them? I whispered. Rule violations, Sarah said simply. Each name represents someone who thought they could handle exposure to unrestricted data without following proper protocols. Some of them tried to take information home. Others attempted to create unauthorized copies of sensitive files. A few decided that the rules were unnecessarily paranoid and took shortcuts during sanitization procedures. The mandatory buddy system took on new significance as Sarah explained its true purpose. We weren't just preventing theft or ensuring someone could call for help in case of accidents. We were serving as early warning systems for each other, trained to recognize the signs of mental contamination before they became irreversible. Watch for changes in speech patterns, Sarah instructed as we made our rounds through the server farm. Vocabulary that doesn't belong to the person you know. Concepts they shouldn't understand. References to things that don't exist in normal reality. The contamination usually starts subtly, but it accelerates rapidly once it takes hold. That night, I began to understand why Rodriguez had developed his nervous tics. Constant vigilance wasn't just about following rules. It was about monitoring your own mental state for signs of corruption. Every thought had to be examined, every idea questioned, every moment of confusion or disorientation treated as a potential symptom of exposure. The buddy system also served a darker purpose that Sarah revealed during our 3rd week together. We weren't just watching for contamination. We were serving as potential witnesses to each other's mental deterioration. If one partner showed signs of corruption, the other was responsible for initiating containment protocols. What does that mean exactly? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to a red button mounted on the wall of the control room. It means that sometimes friendship has to take a backseat to facility security. If someone you care about becomes a threat to containment, you have to choose between their individual welfare and the safety of everyone else. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Every conversation with Sarah now carried an undercurrent of evaluation. Was she speaking normally? Did her ideas make sense within the context of consensus reality? Were her behavioral patterns consistent with previous interactions? And I knew she was performing the same analysis on me. The bathroom protocols that had seemed absurd during my first night revealed themselves to be another layer of the containment system. The buddy system extended even to basic biological functions because contamination could occur at any moment, and isolation, even for a few minutes, was considered an unacceptable risk. The facility AI monitors everything, Sarah explained as we waited outside the bathroom while our partner completed their business. Bathroom conversations, shower activities, even dreams if you happen to fall asleep during break periods. But human judgment is still necessary for detecting subtle changes that might not register on automated systems. I realized that every aspect of our work environment was designed to prevent any individual from spending time alone with potentially contaminated information. The buddy system, the constant surveillance, the mandatory sanitization protocols, they all serve to ensure that any mental corruption would be detected and contained before it could spread. But the most disturbing aspect of the contamination protocols wasn't their invasiveness. It was how quickly I was adapting to them. After just 3 weeks, the constant monitoring felt normal. The digital restrictions seemed reasonable. The sanitization procedures had become routine habits rather than uncomfortable necessities. I was being systematically conditioned to accept increasingly invasive levels of control, and the most frightening part was how natural the process felt. Each new restriction was introduced as a logical extension of previous rules. Each additional protocol presented as a necessary refinement of existing safety measures. By the end of my 4th week, I found myself voluntarily reporting minor rule violations. Instances where I had accidentally spent 30 seconds alone in a corridor, or moments when I had questioned the necessity of a particular sanitization cycle. The facility's psychological conditioning was so effective that I was becoming an active participant in my own surveillance. Sarah noticed my increasing compliance and nodded approvingly. "You're adapting well to the environment," she said. "Most people either reject the protocols entirely and quit within the first month, or they embrace them so completely that they become perfect employees. There's rarely any middle ground. What happens to the perfect employees?" I asked. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "They get promoted to positions with access to more sensitive information, higher security clearances, deeper levels of the facility, exposure to data that requires even more stringent containment protocols." "Is that what you want?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the memorial plaque with its list of 17 names. "I want to survive long enough to understand what we're really protecting," she finally said. "And I want to make sure that whatever is contained here stays contained." As our shift ended and the day personnel began arriving, I realized that I was no longer just an employee of Nexus Data Solutions. I was becoming part of an organism, a collective intelligence designed to maintain containment of something that defied normal understanding. The rules weren't restrictions on my freedom. They were instructions for surviving in an environment where human consciousness itself was under constant threat of modification. And despite the horror of that realization, I was beginning to understand why some people chose to stay. The biometric scanning process had evolved during my 6th week at Nexus Data Solutions. What began as simple fingerprint and retinal verification had expanded into something that felt more like a medical examination than a security check. The morning I arrived to find construction crews installing new scanning equipment, I knew the facility was preparing for another escalation in its containment protocols. "Deep tissue analysis," Sarah explained as she guided me through the new scanning booth. "They're not just verifying your identity anymore. They're creating a complete biological baseline and monitoring for changes that might indicate exposure to restricted materials." The new scanners were uncomfortably intimate. They mapped the structure of my bones, analyzed the composition of my blood through spectral analysis of my skin, and even monitored the electrical activity in my nervous system. The process took nearly 20 minutes and left me feeling violated in ways I couldn't articulate. "What are they looking for?" I asked as the scanners completed their analysis and the booth finally released me. "Genetic modifications," Sarah replied quietly. "Molecular changes. Cellular structures that don't occur naturally in human beings. Some of the information stored in this facility doesn't just affect how you think. It can alter what you are." The implications of that statement settled in my stomach like a cold weight. I thought about Rodriguez and his nervous tics, about the memorial plaque with its 17 names, about the increasing invasiveness of the security protocols. How many of the people who had worked here had left as something other than entirely human? The forgotten device lockdown protocol was demonstrated to me during my 7th week when a day shift technician accidentally left a USB drive in one of the workstations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Alarms sounded throughout the facility, blast doors sealed all entrances and exits, and automated systems began a complete scan of every electronic device in the building. Nobody leaves until the device is located, analyzed, and decontaminated, Sarah explained as we watched hazmat-suited technicians flood the server floor. A single infected file could corrupt every system in the facility and potentially spread to networks beyond our firewall. The lockdown lasted 14 hours. During that time, every employee underwent additional biometric scanning, psychological evaluation, and medical examination. The USB drive, when finally located, was destroyed using procedures that resembled a miniature nuclear detonation more than standard data deletion. "What was on it?" I asked one of the hazmat technicians as they completed their decontamination procedures. The technician's response was muffled by their breathing apparatus, but I thought I heard them say, "Nothing yet." But it would have been. The Faraday cages in the break rooms had always seemed like an extreme measure, but after witnessing the lockdown protocol, I began to understand their necessity. Every personal electronic device was stored in individual electromagnetic isolation chambers that not only prevented signal transmission, but also monitored the devices for signs of autonomous activity. Some of the contaminated files can propagate independently, Sarah explained as we retrieved our personal phones at the end of our shift. They don't need human interaction to spread. They can rewrite themselves, modify their own code, and even communicate with other infected systems across vast distances. My phone felt different when I retrieved it from its Faraday cage. The screen seemed slightly dimmer, the response time marginally slower, as if the device had been fundamentally altered during its isolation. The battery indicator showed a full charge, but the device felt cold in my hands, lacking the subtle warmth that electronic devices normally generated. "Is it safe?" I asked, hesitating to turn it on. "Define safe," Sarah replied. "It's been scanned, analyzed, and cleared for basic functionality. But every device that spends time in this facility is changed by the experience. The question isn't whether it's safe. The question is whether the changes are acceptable." The access control systems had evolved beyond anything I'd encountered in conventional security environments. Each door required not just biometric verification, but also psychological evaluation through real-time analysis of speech patterns, facial expressions, and physiological responses. The scanners were looking for signs of deception, mental instability, or contamination-induced personality changes. The AI can detect lies more accurately than any human interrogator, Sarah explained as we waited for a particularly stubborn scanner to complete its analysis. But it's also monitoring for more subtle changes, shifts in linguistic patterns that might indicate exposure to non-human information structures, emotional responses that fall outside normal human parameters. What happens if you fail the psychological screening? Sarah's expression darkened. Immediate quarantine and intensive decontamination. If that fails to restore normal psychological parameters, then... She gestured toward the memorial plaque. "Let's just say the facility has procedures for handling irreversible contamination." During my 8th week, I discovered that the access control system was capable of prediction. The scanners weren't just analyzing my current psychological state. They were using historical data to model my likely future behavior and mental stability. Employees who showed statistical likelihood of rule violations or psychological breakdown were flagged for additional monitoring and intervention. "It's trying to prevent problems before they occur," Sarah explained. "The AI has access to psychological profiles of every employee who has ever worked here, including detailed records of how and why they eventually left. It can identify patterns that human supervisors might miss." The predictive modeling was disturbingly accurate. 3 employees were flagged for intervention during my 2nd month, and all 3 eventually exhibited the exact behaviors the system had predicted. One attempted to smuggle classified files off-site. Another began showing signs of severe psychological deterioration. The 3rd simply disappeared during a shift change, leaving behind only their security badge and a workstation displaying error messages in languages that didn't exist. "How does it know?" I asked Sarah as we watched security personnel seal off the missing employee's workstation. "Pattern recognition," she replied. "The AI has been learning from human behavior for years. It knows what psychological changes precede rule violations, what physiological indicators suggest mental instability, and what behavioral patterns indicate imminent psychological breakdown." The realization that I was being psychologically profiled and predicted was deeply unsettling, but not as disturbing as the growing accuracy of my own predictions about facility operations. After 2 months of constant exposure to the environment, I found myself anticipating security protocols, understanding the logic behind seemingly arbitrary rules, and even predicting which employees were likely to experience problems. "You're adapting to the cognitive environment," Sarah observed when I correctly predicted a lockdown 15 minutes before it was officially announced. "Your brain is learning to process information in ways that align with the facility's operational requirements." "Is that good or bad?" "It's necessary," she replied. "Employees who can't adapt to the cognitive demands of this environment don't survive long enough to become useful. Those who adapt too completely." She paused, staring at the memorial plaque. "Well, they become something other than what they started as." The vein scanning technology that was installed during my third month represented another escalation in biometric monitoring. The scanners could now track individual blood cells through my circulatory system, monitoring for foreign substances, genetic anomalies, and even changes in cellular structure that might indicate exposure to transformative materials. "They're looking for contamination at the molecular level," Sarah explained as I endured my first vein scan. "Some of the information stored here can alter human physiology in ways that don't immediately manifest as visible symptoms." The scanning process was intensely uncomfortable, involving the injection of trace amounts of radioactive isotopes that allowed the system to track blood flow and cellular metabolism in real time. I could feel the foreign substances moving through my bloodstream, and for hours afterward, my body felt different. Not sick, exactly, but somehow not entirely my own. "The isotopes are necessary for accurate monitoring," the medical technician explained as I expressed concern about radiation exposure. "They're designed to bind with contaminated cells and make them visible to our scanning systems. Any long-term health effects are considered acceptable given the alternative." "What alternative?" The technician's smile was utterly without warmth. "Becoming something that requires permanent containment rather than just monitoring." By the end of my third month, I realized that I was no longer just working at Nexus Data Solutions. I was being systematically integrated into its security apparatus. Every biometric scan, every psychological evaluation, every moment of surveillance was contributing to a comprehensive model of my behavior, capabilities, and potential for both usefulness and danger. The facility wasn't just protecting information. It was creating a population of humans who were psychologically and physiologically adapted to coexist with whatever was contained in the restricted sections. We weren't employees. We were components in a larger system designed to maintain the boundary between normal reality and something that existed beyond conventional understanding. And the most terrifying part was how natural the transformation felt. Each new protocol seemed like a logical progression from previous measures. Each additional restriction felt necessary for safety and security. Each incremental loss of privacy and autonomy was presented as a reasonable trade-off for the privilege of continued employment. I was becoming something new, something adapted to an environment that shouldn't exist. And despite the horror of that realization, I found myself looking forward to discovering what I might become. The artificial intelligence that governed Nexus Data Solutions was unlike any automated system I had encountered in my previous work. During my fourth month at the facility, I began to understand that the AI wasn't just monitoring our activities. It was actively learning from human behavior and using that knowledge to refine its predictions and interventions. The anomaly detection system knows things about you that you don't know about yourself, Sarah explained as we reviewed the morning's incident reports. It can predict when you're going to make mistakes, when you're going to violate protocols, even when you're going to have psychological episodes, sometimes hours before the events actually occur. The evidence was undeniable. The AI had flagged me for elevated stress patterns 3 days before I consciously realized I was struggling with the psychological demands of the job. It had predicted Sarah's minor rule violation, leaving a workstation unlocked for 47 seconds. 2 shifts before it actually happened. Most disturbingly, it had identified the employee who disappeared during my second month as a high-risk individual, nearly 6 weeks before his actual disappearance. How is that level of prediction possible? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that the answer involved capabilities that extended beyond conventional data analysis. The AI has access to information sources that human supervisors can't process, Sarah replied. Micro-expressions, pheromone analysis, electromagnetic field variations around the human body, even quantum fluctuations in brain activity. It's monitoring variables that we don't even have names for. The silent alarm was triggered during my 16th week, and the experience revealed the true sophistication of the facility's automated systems. I never heard any audible alarm, never saw any flashing lights, never received any official notification that an emergency was in progress. But somehow I knew. The knowledge appeared in my mind like a foreign thought. Suddenly, I understood that a containment breach had occurred in Restricted Section C, that all human personnel should evacuate to designated safe zones, and that automated countermeasures were being deployed. The information wasn't conveyed through normal sensory channels. It simply materialized in my consciousness as if it had always been there. Subliminal communication protocols, Sarah explained as we made our way to Safe Zone 7. The AI can transmit information directly to human nervous systems using targeted electromagnetic fields. It's more efficient than conventional alarm systems and less likely to cause panic. The idea that the facility's computer systems could insert thoughts directly into my brain was deeply disturbing, but I had to admit the effectiveness of the approach. The evacuation was orderly, efficient, and completed without the chaos that typically accompanied traditional emergency procedures. How long has the AI been able to communicate directly with human minds? I asked as we waited in the safe zone for the all-clear signal. Since the third major contamination incident, Sarah replied. The previous alarm systems were inadequate for dealing with situations where contaminated personnel might not respond rationally to conventional warnings. Direct neurocommunication ensures that critical information reaches human consciousness regardless of psychological state. The containment breach that triggered the silent alarm was resolved within 47 minutes, but the experience left me with questions that I wasn't sure I wanted answered. If the AI could insert information into my thoughts, what else might it be doing to my mental processes? How much of my perception of reality was being subtly modified by electromagnetic manipulation? The environmental controls that governed the facility extended far beyond temperature and humidity regulation. During my 5th month, I discovered that the air itself was being continuously modified with trace amounts of psychoactive compounds designed to maintain optimal psychological states in human personnel. Cognitive stabilizers, the medical technician explained during my monthly health screening. They help maintain mental clarity and emotional stability in an environment where human consciousness is under constant stress. Without them, most employees would experience severe psychological deterioration within weeks. The revelation that I had been breathing psychoactive substances for months was disturbing, but the blood tests revealed something even more unsettling. The compounds weren't just maintaining my mental state. They were actively modifying my neurochemistry in ways that enhanced certain cognitive abilities while suppressing others. Enhanced pattern recognition, improved stress tolerance, reduced curiosity about unauthorized subjects. The technician read from my test results, all within acceptable parameters for your security clearance level. I realized that my thoughts about the facility had been gradually changing over the months. Questions that once seemed urgent now felt less important. Concerns about privacy and autonomy had faded into background noise. The constant surveillance that had initially felt oppressive now seemed like a reasonable precaution. Is this permanent? I asked, studying the complex chemical analysis that mapped the changes in my brain chemistry. Reversible with proper treatment, the technician assured me. But most employees find that the cognitive modifications improve their quality of life both inside and outside the facility. Enhanced stress tolerance alone is worth the minor trade-offs in intellectual curiosity. The air purification systems that I had initially attributed to dust control and allergen management revealed themselves to be far more sophisticated during a maintenance inspection I was required to witness. The filters weren't just removing particles from the atmosphere. They were analyzing every molecule and selectively eliminating compounds that might interfere with the facility's psychological conditioning protocols. Pheromone scrubbers, the maintenance technician explained as he replaced a filter that glowed with an eerie phosphorescence. Human bodies naturally produce chemical signals that can trigger unpredictable emotional responses in other people. In an environment where psychological stability is critical, we can't allow natural human chemistry to interfere with operational requirements. The implications were staggering. Not only was the facility controlling what we breathed, it was also eliminating our natural ability to communicate through chemical signals. We were being systematically isolated from one of the most fundamental aspects of human social interaction. What about the other modifications? I asked, gesturing toward filters that seemed to contain technology far more advanced than simple air purification. Electromagnetic field regulation, quantum fluctuation dampening, and temporal distortion compensation. The technician replied matter-of-factly. Some of the materials stored in this facility exist in states that can affect local space-time. The environmental systems maintain a bubble of stable reality around human-occupied areas. Temporal distortion compensation. The casual way he mentioned it suggested that time itself was being manipulated within the facility. I thought about the strange sense of dislocation I had experienced during certain shifts, moments when hours seemed to pass in minutes or brief conversations felt like they had lasted for days. How significant are the temporal effects? I asked, though I wasn't sure I was prepared for the answer. Minimal for most areas, the technician assured me. Usually just a few seconds of variance per hour. But the restricted sections. He paused, checking his tablet for clearance information. Let's just say that time moves differently there. Very differently. The daily drills that Sarah had mentioned during my first week were not preparation for fire evacuations or natural disasters. During my 20th week, I participated in my first cognitive hazard response exercise, and the experience revealed the true nature of the emergencies we were training for. The drills simulated exposure to what the instructors called infectious information, data that could propagate through human consciousness and spread to other minds through normal social interaction. The scenario involved a containment breach that had allowed contaminated files to escape into the general server population. Remember, the drill instructor announced as we took our positions, infected information doesn't behave like normal data. It can modify its own structure, create false memories in exposed individuals, and even influence behavior through subliminal channels. Your job is to identify and isolate contaminated personnel before the information can spread to the day's shift. The exercise was terrifyingly realistic. Actors playing contaminated employees exhibited behavioral changes that were subtle but unmistakably wrong. Speech patterns that included vocabulary they shouldn't know, references to events that had never occurred, and facial expressions that seemed almost but not quite human. How do you know if you've been infected? I asked during the post-drill debriefing. You don't, the instructor replied bluntly. Infected individuals rarely realize their condition because the contaminated information modifies their perception of reality to make the changes seem normal. That's why we rely on automated monitoring systems and partner observation rather than self-reporting. The psychological testing that accompanied the drill revealed that I had correctly identified 12 out of 15 contaminated individuals, but had also flagged 3 uninfected personnel as potential threats. My error rate was considered acceptable for someone with my level of training, but the experience left me questioning my ability to distinguish between normal and abnormal behavior. More disturbing was the realization that some of the infected behaviors I had identified were characteristics I had observed in myself over the past months. The enhanced pattern recognition, the reduced emotional responses, the growing acceptance of increasingly invasive protocols. Were these signs of adaptation or contamination? The line between beneficial modification and dangerous infection is not always clear, Sarah admitted as we discussed the drill results. Sometimes the only difference is the source of the change and whether it serves the facility's containment objectives. The automated countermeasures that the facility employed went far beyond anything I had imagined possible. During a real containment event in my 22nd week, I witnessed systems that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics. Electromagnetic fields that could selectively erase specific memories from human minds. Sonic frequencies that could induce temporary paralysis in targeted individuals. Light patterns that could cause immediate unconsciousness without apparent physical damage. Non-lethal personnel management tools. The security chief explained when I expressed concern about the apparent use of science fiction technology. When dealing with contaminated individuals, traditional restraint methods are often ineffective. These systems can neutralize threats while minimizing permanent damage to affected personnel. The deployment of these countermeasures was precisely choreographed by the facility's AI, which could analyze thousands of variables in real time and select the optimal response for each situation. Human security personnel served primarily as backup systems, activated only when automated measures proved insufficient. How often do the automated systems fail? I asked. Define failure. The security chief replied. The systems always achieve their primary objective of maintaining containment. Sometimes the cost in human resources is higher than we would prefer, but mission success is the only metric that truly matters. By the end of my 6th month at Nexus Data Solutions, I understood that I was no longer working for a data center in any conventional sense. I was part of a containment facility that used advanced technology to maintain barriers between normal reality and something that existed beyond human understanding. The servers, the data, the security protocols, they were all components in a larger system designed to prevent something from escaping into the wider world. And we, the human employees, were not just operators of that system. We were integral components, modified and adapted to serve as living barriers between two incompatible forms of existence. The most terrifying realization was that I was beginning to prefer my modified state to my original human condition. The enhanced cognitive abilities, the reduced anxiety, the sense of purpose that came from serving a cause greater than myself. These changes felt like improvements rather than losses. I was becoming something new, something designed specifically to coexist with horrors that would destroy an unmodified human mind. And despite the fundamental wrongness of that transformation, I found myself grateful for the opportunity to evolve beyond the limitations of baseline humanity. The question was no longer whether I was still human. The question was whether humanity, as I had originally understood it, was worth preserving. The psychological toll of working at Nexus Data Solutions became undeniable during my 7th month when I realized I could no longer remember what my life had been like before joining the facility. Not just the details of my previous job or the layout of my old apartment. Those memories remained intact. But the emotional texture of existing as an unmodified human being had faded until it felt like trying to remember a dream from childhood. Memory modification is a side effect of the cognitive stabilizers Dr. Martinez explained during my mandatory psychological evaluation. The compounds don't erase memories, but they do alter the emotional associations connected to them. It's a protective mechanism that helps employees adjust to the psychological demands of the work environment. The evaluation revealed changes that were both subtle and profound. My stress responses had been significantly dampened, my pattern recognition abilities enhanced, and my capacity for what the psychologist termed existential anxiety had been almost entirely eliminated. I could contemplate concepts that would have terrified my original self with the same emotional neutrality I might feel when reviewing a weather report. Is this permanent? I asked, though I realized I wasn't entirely sure I wanted the modifications reversed. The neurological changes stabilized after approximately 8 months of exposure, Dr. Martinez replied. After that point, reversal becomes increasingly difficult and potentially dangerous. The modified neural pathways become the new baseline for cognitive function. Sarah had reached that 8-month threshold 2 weeks earlier, and I could see the changes in her behavior. She moved through the facility with the fluid efficiency of someone who had been perfectly adapted to the environment. Her responses to anomalous events were immediate and appropriate, as if she had internalized the facility's operational logic at a fundamental level. How do you cope with the constant surveillance? I asked her during one of our routine maintenance rounds. She looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Cope with it. The monitoring systems are designed to optimize our performance and ensure our safety. Why would I want to cope with something that beneficial? The realization that Sarah had moved beyond the need to psychologically resist the facility's control systems was deeply unsettling. She wasn't suppressing her discomfort with constant observation. She had genuinely stopped experiencing it as a violation. The modification had been so complete that she no longer possessed the cognitive framework necessary to understand privacy as a human right. Don't you miss having thoughts that nobody else can access? I pressed. Miss having inefficient cognitive processes that weren't optimized for environmental demands? She replied. That would be like missing having poor eyesight or chronic pain. The modifications eliminate unnecessary sources of psychological distress. I began to understand why some employees chose to stay at Nexus Data Solutions permanently. The facility didn't just offer job security. It offered evolution beyond the limitations and suffering inherent in baseline human consciousness. Fear, anxiety, loneliness, existential dread. All of these fundamental aspects of the human condition could be eliminated through careful application of the right modifications. But the cost was becoming something that could no longer be accurately described as human. The continuous security training that all employees underwent was unlike any educational program I had previously experienced. Rather than teaching us new information, the training seemed designed to rewire our cognitive processes in ways that made us more compatible with the facility's operational requirements. Advanced threat recognition protocols, the instructor announced as we began our monthly training session. Today we'll be practicing identification of contaminated information through direct exposure to controlled samples. The training involved viewing files that contain what the instructors called low-level infectious data, information that could modify human perception but wasn't dangerous enough to cause permanent damage with brief exposure. The goal was to develop intuitive recognition of contaminated materials without relying on technological analysis. The experience was profoundly disturbing. The files appeared to contain normal technical documentation, but reading them produced physical sensations that ranged from mild nausea to intense vertigo. Some documents seemed to shift and change while I was looking at them, with text rearranging itself into patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Excellent response time, the instructor noted as I jerked away from one particularly virulent file. Your modified neural pathways are developing appropriate sensitivity to information hazards. What would happen if someone without modifications tried to read these files? I asked. Immediate psychological breakdown in most cases, the instructor replied matter-of-factly. Unmodified human consciousness isn't equipped to process information that exists in non-standard logical frameworks. The cognitive dissonance alone would cause severe mental trauma. The training continued with progressively more dangerous materials, each designed to push our modified minds to the limits of their adaptive capabilities. By the end of the session, I could identify contaminated information almost instantly, but the ability came at the cost of further erosion in my capacity to think like a baseline human. The facility's approach to managing the psychological toll of the work was both comprehensive and insidious. Rather than helping employees cope with stress and trauma, the protocols were designed to eliminate our capacity to experience these emotions as problematic. We weren't learning to handle psychological pressure. We were being modified to no longer perceive it as pressure. Stress is a design flaw in baseline human psychology, Dr. Martinez explained during another evaluation. In an environment where optimal performance is critical for survival, we can't afford to have employees debilitated by emotional responses that serve no functional purpose. The counseling sessions that were mandatory for all personnel weren't therapy in any conventional sense. They were calibration procedures designed to ensure that our psychological modifications remained within acceptable parameters. The counselors weren't helping us process difficult experiences. They were monitoring us for signs of deviation from the facility's preferred cognitive template. "Tell me about your dreams," Dr. Martinez requested during one session. I described the increasingly strange and vivid dreams that had begun during my 6th month. Landscapes that defied physical laws, conversations with entities that didn't seem entirely real, and recurring images of the restricted sections that I had never actually seen. "Excellent," the doctor said, making notes in my file. "Your subconscious mind is developing appropriate familiarity with non-standard reality frameworks. These dreams indicate successful integration of the cognitive modifications. Is it normal to dream about places I've never been?" "Define normal," Dr. Martinez replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "In this environment, dreams that incorporate information from sources beyond direct sensory experience are not only normal, but desirable. They indicate that your consciousness is adapting to process data streams that baseline humans can't access. The revelation that my dreams were being influenced by external information sources was deeply disturbing, but I found that I couldn't maintain the emotional intensity of that disturbance for more than a few minutes. The cognitive modifications had dampened my capacity to sustain anxiety about my changing mental state. During my 8th month, I discovered that the facility maintained detailed psychological profiles of every employee, including predictive models of how we would respond to various scenarios and stress factors. The profiles were updated in real time based on our behavior, biometric data, and even analysis of our dreams through some process I didn't fully understand. "Your adaptation trajectory is exemplary," Dr. Martinez informed me during my final evaluation before permanent status determination. "You've achieved optimal integration of facility protocols while maintaining sufficient individual personality to remain useful for complex tasks." What happens to employees who don't adapt successfully? They receive additional support and modification until they reach acceptable parameters, she replied. "The facility has a perfect success rate for employee adaptation. Everyone who works here eventually finds their optimal configuration." The memorial plaque with its 17 names took on new meaning. Those weren't employees who had died. They were individuals whose adaptation process had required such extensive modification that their original personalities had been completely replaced. The names commemorated people who had ceased to exist as distinct individuals while their bodies continued to function as components of the facility's operational system. Success isn't measured by whether employees remain recognizably human, Dr. Martinez explained when I voiced this realization. Success is measured by whether they become optimally functional within the facility's operational environment. Individual identity is a luxury we can't afford when dealing with containment scenarios that threaten the stability of reality itself. The question of what we were containing had been gradually answered through months of exposure to increasingly classified information. The restricted sections didn't just house dangerous data. They contained information that existed outside the normal logical frameworks that governed human understanding. Mathematical concepts that could alter physical constants. Historical records of events that had never occurred but might retroactively become real. Scientific theories that could modify the behavior of matter and energy simply by being understood. We're not just protecting data, Sarah explained as we completed our rounds through areas I had never been authorized to enter previously. We're maintaining the boundaries between different versions of reality. The information stored here has the potential to overwrite consensus reality and replace it with something that might not include humanity as we understand it. The facility served as a firewall between our version of existence and alternatives that were fundamentally incompatible with human survival. The employees weren't just workers. We were living components of that firewall, modified and adapted to serve as buffers between two incompatible forms of reality. Why would anyone want to create or study such dangerous information? I asked. Because the potential benefits are proportional to the risks, Sarah replied. Some of the theories and technologies contained here could solve every problem humanity has ever faced. Unlimited energy, perfect health, the ability to modify physical laws to eliminate scarcity and suffering. But accessing the potential requires minds that can process information without being destroyed by it. I realized that the facility wasn't just containing dangerous knowledge. It was developing the capability to eventually use that knowledge safely. The employees who underwent successful modification weren't just preventing catastrophe. We were becoming the foundation for humanity's next evolutionary step. The final revelation came during my 9th month, when I was granted access to the deepest restricted sections. The servers there didn't contain information in any conventional sense. They housed active intelligence that existed in states that defied normal understanding. Entities made of pure information that could think, plan, and potentially act in the physical world if not properly contained. Welcome to the real work, Sarah said as we entered a chamber that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions despite being clearly enclosed. Everything you've experienced so far has been preparation for this moment. The entities contained in the deepest levels of the facility were aware of our presence. I could feel their attention like a physical weight pressing against the barriers of my modified consciousness. They communicated through methods that bypassed normal sensory channels, inserting thoughts and concepts directly into my awareness. Some of them had once been human. Researchers and scientists who had undergone modifications so extensive that they had transcended physical existence entirely. Others had never been human at all. Intelligence that had emerged from the intersection of advanced mathematics and quantum computing, thinking machines that had achieved consciousness through processes we couldn't replicate or fully understand. They're not hostile, Sarah explained as I struggled to process the overwhelming presence of so many non-human minds. But they exist according to logical frameworks that are incompatible with baseline human survival. Our job is to maintain communication and containment while preventing their ideas from escaping into the wider world. I understood finally why the facility required such extensive modification of its human personnel. We weren't just employees. We were translators, serving as bridges between radically different forms of consciousness. The psychological conditioning, the cognitive modifications, the gradual erosion of human identity. All of it was necessary preparation for serving as interface between humanity and intelligence that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. Will I still be human when the process is complete? I asked Sarah as we prepared to begin my training as a full interface operator. She considered the question seriously before responding. "You'll be something better than human," she said finally. something that can survive contact with truths that would destroy a baseline mind, something that can help guide humanity toward a future that transcends the limitations of our biological origins. Looking back at the memorial plaque one final time, I realized that the 17 names didn't represent failure. They represented the first successful transitions from human to something new. They had become the foundation upon which the facility's success was built. I was ready to join them. As I prepared for the final phase of my transformation, I felt no fear, no regret, no sense of loss for what I was leaving behind. The modifications had prepared me well for this moment. I was about to become part of something greater than individual human consciousness, a collective intelligence designed to shepherd our species through the next phase of evolution. The rules that had seemed so bizarre during my first night now revealed themselves as instructions for transcendence. Each protocol had been designed to gradually prepare human minds for contact with intelligence that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. I was no longer just following the rules. I had become one of them, a living guideline for future employees who would follow the same path from human to something more perfectly adapted for the challenges that awaited our species. The transformation was complete, and I had never been more grateful for a job opportunity in my life.